I think since we wanted to move on, this is a perfect segue to our final and probably our longest topic of the session, namely the ranking of the new, I call them new teams even though they are now over a decade old, but the ranking of the 27 drivers who have driven for the 2010 teams.
So, 27 drivers, 16 rejects. Now, Lennart and I have gone about this in a very different way from one another. His plan is to rank them all from best to worst, worst to best. You can do it as you like. And I have decided that meritocracy is a thing of the past. We must be egalitarian and give everyone prizes. So, I have decided to give an elaborate prize for all the different 27 heroes of the new teams. And yes, we're calling them the new teams because I don't care. If Nintendo can release new Super Mario Brothers and then follow it up with new Super Mario Brothers 2 when it gets old, then we can have the new teams and be forever called the new teams. I don't care. So we have 3 teams, each of which went under at least one name change. Hispania Racing Team, which became HRT Formula 1 Team. Then we had Virgin, which became Virgin Marussia, which became Marussia, which became Marussia Manor, which became Manor. And then we have Team Lotus. Lotus Racing, which became Team Lotus, which became Lotus Caterham, or did I make that bit up? And then it became Caterham.
It was the Caterham part was directly a switch, not with a sponsorship step in between.
It's a terrifying, confusing mess, Lennart.
Oh yeah, so the entire Lotus mess could be worth an entire episode if we actually bother to research it.
So this part of the podcast is merely a memorial to those great heroes, because they were all heroes, those drivers who drove. And we're only talking about the ones who actually set foot in the car and drove during a Grand Prix weekend in the race or in the qualifying. We're not mentioning people like Luis Razia, unless you have them on your list, Lennart. No, I don't. I'm not sure you do. But Luis Razia, who was so close to getting the drive with it was Marussia. He almost got the place in favor of Jules Bianchi. Actually, imagine how different history would have been under that in that timeline.
I kind of don't want to.
But yes, so we're talking about the 27 drivers who drove in anger in Formula 1 in the new teams. So how are you ranking them?
Well, we're going to go with worst to best, partly to build anticipation, but mostly because the higher I am, the more confident I am of my positions. Especially positions 27, 26, 25 are functionally all interchangeable. So if you don't like any of the names we're going to mention, you are free to put them right at the bottom if that makes you confident.
Let's not beat about the bush, Lennart. They are all almost interchangeable, bar about 4 drivers. I'm sorry.
Points there. Well, but yeah, that's the problem with driving cars that are just well behind the rest of the grid, that you really find it hard to compare them to anything, except obviously their direct teammates, and sometimes not even then, given how pretty much, for example, HRT was a one-car operation by the end of 2012, simply because they didn't have any money for new parts. But yeah.
So old school master Lennart will be dishing out grades and awards, or at least a ranking of worst to best, and I will be the modern happy school teacher who gives a prize to everyone, and each driver will get their own individual unique prize especially for them to reward them for their efforts during their Formula 1 season. So, shall we begin?
Indeed, and we will begin with a former DTM driver in my 27th place, obviously. We're beginning with Roberto Meri.
Ooh, interesting choice. You mean the driver who finished 3rd place there this year in the Formula 2 at the age of 31?
Mind you, I would personally call that more an indictment of Formula 2 than a praise of the man himself, but hey, that's neither nor there.
So why is Roberto Meri last?
Well, to be blunt about it, his performance was not particularly impressive. I mean, he was one of the drivers who was in the car when Manor were the only new team left, so it's really hard to compare him, but he was comprehensively beaten by Will Stevens, who is not ranked particularly high either. We'll get to him.
Is Will Stevens next?
No, I actually got, spoiler alert, 2 names in between. So,
wow.
Yeah, but in the end he was just, as I said, the last places are pretty much interchangeable, and he was of the last placed people the least impressive. I don't recall him ever doing anything of relevance, even by the standards of 2015 Manama Russia, but in the end I could not find anything that would put him above any other name on the list. And so, yeah,
I feel the
someone
same
has
way.
to be last, and someone has to be the, what would technically be the DNQ, if that were a classic 90s Formula 1 grid.
Yeah, so I got an individual present for each person, and it's funny we start with Roberto Merri because it's my least inspired present. What do you get someone when you don't have any idea what to get them for their birthday or for anything? What do you get them, Leonard?
I personally project my own likings and give them a book.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, I was not nearly as inspired. I got him chocolates because that's what you get when you have no idea what to get someone. And I have no idea what to think about Roberto Merri's Formula 1 career because, let's face it, nobody remembers Roberto Merri's Formula 1 career. Okay.
Even I
He's
don't.
26.
26, we're going back to the very beginning of the new teams era, namely 2010. And we're beginning with the man with the dodgy neck, Sakon Yamamoto.
Sakon Yamamoto, indeed. 3-time super sub, once at Super Aguri, once at Spiker, but obviously most famously and in his greatest time at HRT Formula 1 team in 2010.
Yeah, the thing is, why I place him above Mary is probably a relevant question, and the answer, again, outside of, I guess someone had to be last, is that he at least qualified a relatively more competitive driver than Bruno Senna. I think it was one time. They're 4 or 5 races together, and in the end it's just a question of, who was the least impressive against not impressive competition, and at that point I would simply just put Mary lower than Yamamoto, because again Yamamoto simply faced a slightly better driver, Bruno Senna, and I think he also faced clean ones. We'll get to him later. And in the end it's just he was slightly less not good, and so he got 26th and Mary got 27th, and
you really are damning Yamamoto with faint praise here. Yeah, there's nothing to remember about Yamamoto other than that he was much slower than his team, basically all of his teammates. I remember he was at least a second slower than I think even Bruno Senna in qualifying. As a present to Yamamoto, I understand that nowadays he's a politician. He recently got elected to the parliament in Japan, and so I understand he'll have a lot of traveling to do. So for his prize, he shall be receiving a travel pillow to help with any possible neck pain he might have during the flights.
An excellent choice, I must say.
Okay, 25th.
25th, and we are staying with 2010 HRT because there is a popular commentator nowadays, but back then he was a very unimpressive HRT driver, and his name is Karun Chandok.
Excellent choice, although I'm not sure I would personally have him so far down, but yeah, Karun Chandok, he really didn't get very much chance to prove himself, and I'm sure that's probably why you've put him so far down, is he didn't really have very much of a career to really comment on.
Yeah, that is a part of it. Simply, I mean, he was he the first driver to be replaced in 2010? But I think he was, and
among the first at least.
Yeah, and in the end, his 2011 one-race comeback with Lotus wasn't particularly impressive either. In the end, I tried to find something to put him higher because, again, I know he's popular and I know some people are going to give me some criticism for this choice, but I couldn't find anything. Couldn't find anything where I could justify putting him ahead of a couple of names on this list. But as I said, it's just not that special.
I remember he had a really embarrassing crash at Monaco where I think he bumped into Timo Glock and did a crash similar to
that's that one. He was the one I did. I remember that crash, but I don't actually recall who was involved in it on the HRT side. I know it was with Trulli actually, where he parked himself on Trulli's head. But yeah, I didn't actually remember which HRT that was, which kind of But yeah, that accident alone then again would justify my choice. So yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of weird crashes that year because Barrichello also did the weird 360 in the middle of the road, and they had to crane him out. What a strange race that was. But so Karen Chanduk famously said that the car that they'd brought as the demonstration model back in like February 2010 was promised to be just as I said, a demonstration model, and that from there they were going to improve the car, build big new parts from the Dallara chassis and everything, and it basically never arrived. The demonstration model ended up becoming the car that they actually used for the whole season. And so I thought, what do you do when the thing that you've paid money for is late, delayed, or otherwise cancelled? You get a refund. And so if I, as an award, I will give Karen Chanduk a refund for his 2010 stint in which he was oversold on his drive and probably should have got his money back. I'm assuming he paid for his drive. I'm assuming he didn't get a single penny from driving an HRT.
Sure, 100%. I would be very amazed if he didn't pay for it. Obviously, like that is one thing people tend to misunderstand about pay drivers. They obviously get a wage themselves, but that wage is also covered by the sponsor usually. It's not a standard procedure, but it's pretty much close to it. So obviously he got paid, I don't have actual numbers, but generally when we're talking about that kind of pay drivers, we're talking about a couple of 100,000 in the season. But again, that's also sponsorship money, so yeah.
Okay, who's next on our list?
Well, I mentioned him earlier, and thus we have a 24th place Will Stevens, as I spoiled before.
Will Stevens is another driver I have absolutely nothing to talk about because he was better than Roberto Berry, but he was also probably in the most uninspired driver lineup of any team in recent Formula One history, unless you discount, Adrian Sutil and Esteban Gutierrez the year before at Sauber. But yeah, Will Stevens. The only thing memorable about him is the fact that his name makes a joke in English. Will Stevens do this? Will Stevens do that? And that is about as memorable as he gets. With a different first name, I'm not sure anyone would have anything to say about him.
Bob Stevens. Yeah, that would be a name that would be completely forgotten by tomorrow. Of the last day of the last race. He would be the number... I mean, he pretty much already is, but he would be the number one choice of forgotten Formula One driver threads across all of the internet.
Oh, yeah, at least in modern terms. I was thinking about what to get him as a present, so I thought getting him one of these novelty old-fashioned desk name signs, which has his name on it, except has a question mark on the end. Or, if I couldn't get that, chocolates.
I do like the question mark, it's a very nice touch. Will
Stevens? Alright, who's next? I really didn't have anything to talk about Will Stevens, but I guess we'll just keep going.
See, the thing is, why I ranked him below Bruno Senna was because he had been a less impressive teammate, and he actually had he actually had 3 teammates in his F1 career, but we're not counting the Caterham one, because we get to them. But the thing is, we are talking about his other teammate, and that is Alexander Rossi. He of the IndyCar 500 win.
Yes, Alexander Rossi, he had the promise of entering Formula One for over a year before he actually did so. There was talk of him moving in to Max Chilton's place in 2014 when Chilton's money started drying up around the summer break, as we all know. Following the tragic crash of Jules Bianchi, Marussia Manor went into administration about a week or two afterwards, and they were firmly running out of money, basically, the team. And Alex Rossi was a very talented young driver who just didn't get the chance to drive in a car which would have benefited him, which would have showed his talents. It took him ages to get going, and when he did, it unfortunately has basically been forgotten. If he hadn't won the Indy 500 the following year, I'm sure his efforts would really have gone down almost anonymously. And for him, the award I'm giving him is a poorly aired balloon. And by that I mean that he took ages to get going, and then the effect was like a wet farting sound. So
brilliant, I love it. He probably won't, but we're not sponsored by Alexander Rossi, so we can say what we want.
Indeed. Do you have anything you want to say about Alexander Rossi?
Not much outside of what I said in my intro. He technically beat Will Stevens in qualifying. He was there. He didn't do much, but he didn't also do nothing wrong. My English is on point as usual. No, but yeah, I don't have anything particular to say about it. There's going to be a topic for a number of these drivers that are still to come. I think we're only going to get into really juicy meat once we get in the upper half of the table.
Well, without further ado, let's carry on then.
And we got another reject in 22nd place, and it's Bruno Senna.
Yes, Bruno Senna. There's a really good article about him on this website I really like. It's called gprejects.com. And no, it's the first article I ever wrote, the first profile I ever wrote for anyone was about Bruno Senna. His time at HRT was, ironically, possibly his most fruitful time, and it was in the slowest car he was ever in. And he got the most races out of that 2010 HRT, or Hispania as it was known at the time. And he certainly had the measure of his teammates, and it seems like in retrospect he was the strongest of those drivers. Maybe Christian Klein would have been stronger, but we didn't see enough of him, only towards the end of the season. But yeah, Bruno Senna was a absolutely dependable okay driver, and it's quite amazing considering the background he had and how he got to Formula 1 in the first place. So I'm torn on him. In HRT he did okay, and I think he deserves some merit for that.
Yeah, he did get some merit in that he isn't the worst ranked HRT driver on this list, on my list. So, and given as I have my well-known personal resentment of the guy for reasons that are absolutely not his fault. Yeah. Anyway.
For my present for Bruno Senna, I will give him a subscription to a course in Microsoft Office Suite. This is so that he can learn how to send emails properly. Famously, he lost his drive in the 2010 British Grand Prix because he was sending an email to his sister about how much he hated Colin Collis, the team principal, and then sent it instead of to his sister to Colin Collis himself, who proceeded to bench him immediately.
Wow.
This podcast is not sponsored by the Microsoft company.
Nor is it sponsored by Colin Collis.
God, no.
At least then.
What would he pay us?
Free dentistry.
Would he pay us an exposure?
Exposure or free dentistry?
That's true. Okay, who's next?
On to P21, and we have Guido van der Garde. The
interesting choice.
Dutch rich sensation that, by all logic, should have been in Formula 1 much earlier than he was, and spent a year with the Green Boys at Caterham.
Yeah, as you say, he had a long junior career where he was touted for a Formula 1 seat since the late 2000s, but didn't actually ever get in until 2013, aside from a brief possible revival of that career in 2015, when Manisha Kaltenborn accidentally did a McLaren and hired too many drivers.
I was going to actually make a joke. I think we should now call her McLaren Kaltenborn, but...
Basically, yeah. So Guido van der Garde, he had a very anonymous time in Formula 1. He far outranked Charles Pic, in my opinion at least. But I see that Charles Pic hasn't been mentioned yet. But I think he far outranked Charles Pic, and he's become more famous than his Formula 1 career since it's been over basically on social media, because he likes to shitpost. I don't know what the family friendly way of saying that word is, but yeah, he posts nonsense on social media.
They won't know it's cursing. He's doing Scheiße.
Because no one in the world speaks German, so no one will know what that word means.
Indeed, no one. I don't know anyone who speaks German. No, sorry.
If Hollywood has taught me anything, there are no other languages. There are just different accents of English. So Guido van der Garde, I think he was very strong. I think he perfectly had the measure of Sharp Peak, and it's a bit strange and a bit sad almost that he never got any other drives, but I think that was a money issue. As a present, I would give him a free ride in a Sauber C34 around the Albert Park circuit, as he was promised in 2015, but sadly that has never happened yet, so that would be my present to him.
Justice for Guido. Anyway, on to P20, and less people willing to make an ass out of themselves with their opinions would probably have this name not even listed, because he only ever had one race, which lasted all of a couple of seconds. Now we're talking about the Le Mans legend and Super Formula star André Lotterer.
André Lotterer, and anyone who's watching motorsport these days will have seen André Lotterer in Formula E, where frankly he's never really impressed. He's never been very good at Formula E. I don't know why he's still there after all these 25 consecutive seasons of crashing in Formula E. But yeah, those of you who are a bit young probably don't know that André Lotterer went into Formula One with an amazing glittering junior career, whether that was in Super Formula, as you say, in Japan, or in endurance racing. How many times has he won Le Mans? 4 times, I think it is.
4 or 3 times. I'd have to look it up, which I will do because...
At least 3 times. We're not talking some mug who's just been brought in from the junior series to fill a spot. We're talking one of the great drivers of that decade, or at least of that 10-year period, being put into the worst car on the grid and making it about 400 meters before his engine blew up.
It was actually 3 times. I've looked it up, and actually the last one was in the year he got his Formula One deal. So obviously that story is obviously not true, but we're going to pretend it is. The 2014 Le Mans victory got him the prestigious honor of driving a Caterham. So,
well, I couldn't have done him any. Couldn't have done him any. What's the opposite of favors? Couldn't have been a problem for Caterham to have the reigning Le Mans winner in their car. I mean, I don't think any other teams had the reigning Le Mans winner in their car. So, for André Lotterer, I would give him as a present an old can of 7-Up. This podcast is not sponsored by 7-Up, but it would be a memorial to Schumacher. That's Michael Schumacher, not Mick or David or Ralph, in 1991, who famously debuted for Jordan. So André Lotterer, I believe, just like Michael, he blew up in the early stages of the first lap, except this time without the fizz.
And without being hired by Benetton afterwards, because Benetton doesn't exist anymore.
Rest in peace.
Yeah. This podcast is not sponsored by Benetton. Yeah, on to P19, and we have another HRT driver. The most surprising comeback of the 2010s, I'd wager, in Formula One, namely the Indian driver Narain Kartikeya.
Ah, yes, the cucumber himself. What do we say about Narain Kartikeya? He is among the 2 drivers who have the most recent DNQ in Formula One, and that is really an achievement. DNQs are something that we never thought we'd see again in Formula One, probably after the mid-2000s, especially in this age of hyper-reliability and the franchise, that basically the FIA didn't want to DNQ anyone, even though they were super slow. And Narain Kartikeya proved them wrong. He got himself DNQ'd, because screw the FIA.
A salute to the hero.
Yeah, salute to the hero, and his teammate as well, but we'll get to him. I like Kartikeya. He was obviously the wrong driver to pick if you wanted to get any results, but for some reason they hired a 35-year-old Narain Kartikeya to drive in the slowest car on the grid twice, and I personally don't understand that decision, but the Lord works in mysterious ways, Lennart. If I were to give him a present, I would give him a signed apology from Sebastian Vettel.
That's a good one. One thing that always must be mentioned when talking about Narain Kartikeya and HRT is the fact that he is the only teammate before Lando Norris to beat Danny Ricciardo.
Beat him in what way? In the standings, you mean?
Yes. No, not in the standings, but in race results.
And yeah, the best bit about that is I cannot argue against that. Narain Karthikeyan is on the level of Lando Norris when we're talking about talent.
Undeniable facts.
I mean, they've won the same number of races.
Indeed. We should note that this podcast is not sponsored by Tata.
You're not saying that had anything to do with him getting signed for 2 years at a backmarker team, are you, at the age of 35?
No. That's ridiculous. They're ridiculous.
Moving swiftly on.
Insulting.
Moving swiftly on.
Yes, on to P18, and fittingly for such an anonymous place, why did I say we? I have put Charles Peak in there.
The royal we. Charles Peak, who I also wrote a profile on. Charles Peak, the most anonymous driver of his age. He's one of 2 drivers who's driven with 2 of the new teams, the other being Karun Chandok. I'm not sure if any other driver drove with more than one of the 2 new teams. But Charles Peak drove for 2 full seasons and did absolutely nothing in either of them. It's quite an achievement in itself, just how much he represents that era of anonymity, hyper-reliability, and absolute nothingness that was the early 2010s, especially when it came to driver personalities, of which he had none.
Yeah. I mean, what else can I say to that? You summarized it excellently. I can point out that we have a great profile of him on our gpreject.com website, and you should obviously go and read it. But other than that, it's just giant static.
If I were to give him a present, I thought long and hard about this. So often people who are going through emotional stress, or people who have behavioral problems, for example, often use comedy or forms of comedy and out of themselves behavior as a way of projecting a personality onto something. And so I would give Sharpeak a ventriloquist doll, as it might allow him to project some kind of personality onto something. Maybe there is a comedian inside the heart of Sharpeak, and I would love to see it come out.
Oh man, that is good. What line? That is kind of cruel, and I love it.
No regrets. Next.
Yeah, the next one I want to introduce with a very entertaining statistic. Namely with the 2017 Indianapolis 500. This driver was the driver who led the most reps in that race. And I give to you in P17 Max Talent Chilton.
Oh, what is there to say about Max Talent Chilton? He was also there for a year and a half, almost 2 years. He was teammates with the late great Jules Bianchi. He was not the more talented of those 2 drivers, despite talent being his middle name. I had the honor of seeing him at Silverstone in 2014, and he was famously in last place because he jumped into the pits during the red flag, which he wasn't allowed to do, and then he spent about half of the race catching up with Kamui Kobayashi, who was in the catering room at the time. And when he passed him in front of our very eyes at the stands, the whole stand whooped and cheered and jumped up and down, and it was the best moment of the race when Max Chilton overtook Kamui Kobayashi for 19th place. I just wanted to share that anecdote with you because that's the only thing I remember about Max Chilton.
It is a very great story. Do you have a gift for him?
You have nothing to add? Okay. I would have a gift to him would be, because I'm egalitarian today and I don't believe in giving anyone, no matter how talented they are, anything more than anyone else, I will give him a sticky badge that says, well done. A sticky badge where if he picked at it, it would just lose its stickiness pretty quickly and then fall off. I don't believe his talent should go rewarded if he didn't do anything with it. Because if he was so talented, then I believe he would probably have done better than he did.
Yeah.
Something's telling me that this Max Talent Chilton is like a joke.
Oh my god, we're breaking new grounds in terms of temerity and sacrilege here.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic. All right, next.
Yeah, and speaking of the Indianapolis 500, we're staying with that because the 16th placed finisher in my ranking is Marcus Ericsson. I want to note that we have 2 Indianapolis 500 winners in the bottom half of the driver rankings of the 2010 teams, which incidentally, if anyone ever doubts the classic argument for adding new teams, that there are more spots for talented young drivers on the grid with them, you are disproven. Officially.
Yeah.
You have no arguments against this. You are done.
Yeah, like how many Indianapolis winners are on the grid right now? None, I'm going to guess. I'm going to take a wild guess and say none.
No, it's actually none.
Ah, dear. Marcus Ericsson, believe it or not, was the one driver I forgot. Because I wrote down all 27 driver names, and I had written down 26. And I was like, who is the 27th? And it was Marcus Ericsson, who, ironically enough, has basically the longest career of all these drivers, bar possibly Daniel Ricciardo, well, obviously Daniel Ricciardo, but I think he's the second most experienced driver of all these drivers that we're talking about today. And I completely forgot that he drove a full season for Caterham in 2014. As a result, as a present, I would give him a copy of the 2014 Formula One season review so that he can find himself in it and remember that he was there.
I love it.
I don't think he was much slower or much faster than Kamui Kobayashi. I think Kobayashi did have the benefit of the crowd on his side, so I think any memories that I have of that would probably be skewed by the fact that I really liked Kobayashi. So I don't actually remember if Marcus Ericsson was particularly fast or slow compared to his teammate, but the team was falling apart anyway, and he didn't exactly get a good chance to, shine, to show himself.
Yeah, Kobayashi was ahead, which is part of the reason why he is where he will be ranked, but it's not as much as you would expect. Pretty much the same relation he had with Charles Leclerc, where obviously Leclerc won the team duel and team battle by a noticeable margin, but it wasn't like he was completely hopeless.
No. And just on that note, I'm going to make a correction to my earlier statement. Will Stevens also raced with 2 of the teams. He drove with Caterham in 2014 for 1 race before moving to Manor in 2015.
Yeah, and funnily enough, that wouldn't even have happened if Caterham's financial situation hadn't been so atrocious, because as I talked about in the last podcast,
of course,
it was pretty much agreed upon that none other than Rubens Barrichello would take the Caterham for the last few races of that 2014 season before the team's insolvency. But what could have been?
What could have been? Lewis Razia in Jules Bianchi's place and Rubens Barrichello in Will Stevens' place.
So we should be thankful for the sake of this podcast that didn't happen, because I would have completely thrown our reason out of the window. I would have placed him second no matter how good he was.
Am I so out of touch? No, it is the audience who are wrong. Okay, who's next?
Yeah, the next one is actually going to be, well, as close to controversial as we are going to get with this. And that is the fact that I have put Christian Klein here. Now, obviously,
why so high?
Indeed, people are going to ask why I placed him so high compared to all the other 2010 HRT drivers. And that was because he was the only one out of the bunch who was actually hired for ability. And the thing is, he was originally brought in to do Friday testing for the team. And because he did so well with that, he actually got promoted to the actual team, even though we're talking about a peak Colin Collins operation where money is everything. And the fact that he was that good to get that gig, because I don't think Red Bull paid anything for it, that is why I put him relatively high in comparison to the others. So, yeah, Christian Klein.
Yeah, surprising choice, but I think you argued it quite well. I have nothing really to say about him other than the fact that he was obviously quite competent, which made a change from Sakon Yamamoto, who he replaced. I think he originally replaced him for 1 race in Singapore because Sakon Yamamoto got food poisoning, I think it was. And from there, suddenly they realized that actually they might actually do really well with Christian Klein, because Christian Klein can, qualify within a second of his teammate, maybe even out-qualify his teammate. And I think that's why he did 1 race, I think, at Singapore, and then ended up coming back towards the end. If I were to get Klein present, I would get him one of these private phone numbers, which doesn't appear on the yellow pages, so he no longer has to take Colin Collis' calls.
Given that he had a random guest appearance in McLaren GT3 car and DTM last season, I think he's going to love not being caught by random teams anymore.
Well, you just said McLaren again. He might be on the short list for upcoming signings for this silly season. Christian Klein to the 2023 McLaren.
Let's do it. How old is he anyway?
Must be about 40 years old at this point. But, Fernando Alonso's still going strong. Who's to say that Christian Klein wouldn't be too?
Yeah,
I think you're just ageist, Lennart.
He'd be actually at 40 at the start of next season, so perfect age. Yeah, anyway, on to the next driver on the list. And we are getting to a debut here because this is the first, and let's be honest here, for the foreseeable future, only Indonesian driver in Formula 1 history, namely Rio Haryanto.
I have very strong opinions on this, Lennart. Rio Haryanto is very close to my heart. Rio Haryanto is one of the few drivers of the last 10 years who really embodied that reject spirit. Nikita Mazepin obviously did due to his pace, but Nikita Mazepin isn't as fun when you know about the backstory, and it's not a feel-good reject story, whereas Rio Haryanto really, really is. He won Driver of the Day every single round that he took part in, which is incredible. I don't think anyone has ever won 12 consecutive Driver of the Day awards in Formula 1 ever. But, this is the world we live in. And none of them were awarded to him, because apparently, if it's awarded to the wrong driver, the FIA will simply disallow the award. Much like when Nikita Mazepin gets a fastest lap in Belgium, if they don't like who got it, they will simply remove it. So, Rio Haryanto I have very strong opinions about. I don't think he was very good, but I think he really embodied the reject spirit, and it's a shame that there aren't more drivers like him in Formula 1.
I can only agree with you on that, and I honestly felt your passion, and I can only agree that I feel the very same way, even though I couldn't quite formulate it as nice as you could. And it's just, as you said, it's a travesty that they denied him his Driver of the Day awards, and it is also a travesty and tragedy that Nikita Mazepin didn't get his fastest lap of the race. So yeah, screw you, FIA. We are on your metaphorical rear for that one, and forever will be.
If what I heard was true, then I think Nikita Mazepin also won many of the first few races Driver of the Day awards in the beginning of his career last year, and I think those were all disallowed as well. So what else? What else aren't the FIA telling us?
It's a scandal. Also, this podcast is not sponsored by Indonesian or Russian companies.
If I had to give Rio Haryanto a present, it would be to give him back those 12 Driver of the Day awards and give him a proper certificate and signed by, what's not Jean Todt anymore? Who is it these days? Mohammed bin Sulayem?
Yes.
I would get him to personally pardon Rio Haryanto and apologize on behalf of the entire Formula 1. Have all the drivers kneel at the beginning of one of the races in respect to him, and I say that's enough.
The next driver is one who currently is still in Formula 1 and is pretty used to the position I've placed him in at the present moment. In P13 we have Daniel Ricciardo.
Ouch! What an intro. Absolutely brutal. Yeah. I mean, if we'd recorded this podcast 4 years ago, we'd have such a different way of opening this. But yeah, we're currently recording this at the time when Daniel Ricciardo is having his I was going to say his annus horribilis, but I thought that was last year, so his second annus horribilis in a row. Again, I have quite strong feelings on Daniel Ricciardo. He didn't impress me a huge amount when he was at HRT, or actually when he was at Toro Rosso. I think he was a driver a lot like Vettel, who had very strong qualifying from time to time, but simply didn't. I said many times that he, to use your phrases, Lennart, was not it. Simply was not it. I didn't see the hype, and I was a bit confused when he was promoted to Red Bull, because all the way from the beginning, all the way in HRT, I didn't think he had what it took. So, as my present to Daniel Ricciardo, my award to him will be an apology from me. Because he certainly rubbed that back in my face from 2014 onwards and has become, one of the great drivers of the last 10 years, even allowing for the bad years of the last 2 years at McLaren. So.
Yeah, that's obviously something that is often influencing our perception of the drivers, what we saw of them before Formula One, what they did there. We will address that point later, by the way, in my rankings. But yeah, sometimes you just get proven wrong.
I don't have much else to say about Daniel Ricciardo, other than that he, as you say, got outperformed by Narain Karthikeyan. So I don't know why you placed him above Narain Karthikeyan, but that is not for me to judge.
Perhaps I didn't quite get into the spirit of the cruel ranker and thought he also deserved a gift for his terrible years right now. So, sorry, Narain. I know you are strong enough to take on for the team.
Okay, number 12 are we on to now?
Indeed, and we're going back to 2010 because number 12 is Lucas Di Grassi.
Lucas Di Grassi, Formula E winner, although I'm not sure I would say it was all that legitimate knowing what I know about Formula E. In fact, Lucas Di Grassi winning Formula E was one of the things that made me stop watching it. Lucas Di Grassi nowadays is known for being a bit of a loudmouth, but he has always been a pretty talented driver. I mean, they say no one really gets to Formula One unless you have talent these days. And Lucas Di Grassi in manner must be one of the most forgettable of these drivers. However, he wasn't terrible. He was wrong time, I think. I think Lucas Di Grassi, had he been in a different team or at a different time, I think he could have done something with his career at Formula One. But sometimes that's just the opportunity you get presented to you. And
have you gotten him a gift already?
I have. I got him a framed picture of Alain Prost spinning off on the formation lap at San Marino in 1991. Because although Lucas Di Grassi had his shunt, which was rather embarrassing at Suzuka in 2010, but it wasn't even on the formation lap, I think it was on the sighting lap going out of the pits. I want him to know that it happens to the best of us, even to Lucas Di Grassi and even to Alain Prost. And it even happened to Romain Grosjean. Crashing on the formation lap is not something that he alone has done, but it remains the only thing people will probably remember him for.
All right, on to the next one. And the topic for, or let's just say the overarching theme for two of the three next drivers will be the quality of opposition they faced and how they performed against them. Namely, we're going to go relatively high with the latest driver to join a new team. P11 goes to Esteban Ocon.
Esteban Ocon, like Max Chilton, he had a really good ability to finish races. I didn't mention that actually when we were talking about Max Chilton, but he was very reliable. If not fast, he was at least reliable. Esteban Ocon was very, very young. He was still 19 when he got jumped in Rio Haryanto's place, and I think he did really, really well. He had one legendary moment at Manor, which I'm sure if you don't mention, I will. Do you have anything to mention about Esteban Ocon?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why he's ranked relatively high despite his late entry and his relatively short career with the 2010 teams is, again, because he was, again, I'm reaching a bit, but I don't think it's particularly going to be surprised that Pascal Wehrlein will be relatively high on this ranking, and he fared very well against him despite being a mid-season addition and having spent the 2016 at that time cruising around in a Mercedes in the DTM midfield. So yeah, that's, as I said, the topic will be faring well against your very good team 2010 team's teammate. Nice wording. I can't speak today. Yeah, anyway, so he did well. He did very well, jumping into that car in the middle of the season when Rio's money ran out. And yeah.
His real moment of legend was when in Brazil 2016 he was one lap away from scoring points. Unfortunately, we can't have nice things in Formula One, and so he did not score a 10th place finish. At Brazil, he was overtaken in the wet on the final lap, and it remains the second biggest tragedy to happen in the wet on the final lap in Brazil, to my memory. But yeah, as a present, I would give him a framed screenshot of that moment when he was in 10th, one lap away from scoring points for Manor, that which would have sealed him in reject history. But,
and it would have saved Manor, but
damn you, Felipe Nasra.
And I want to stress that him losing his seat in Formula One is karma for that.
Yeah, He lost his seat due to the fact that they didn't need to pay him because he had given them the money they needed through his performances. Oh, the irony. Moving depressingly onwards, who's next?
We are now entering the top 10, and in 10th place we have Kamui Kobayashi.
Kamui Kobayashi. Yeah, a hard one to rate, because I know you're not a huge fan of Kamui Kobayashi. I know you think in general he's been a bit overrated by the fan base. But 2014 he had one final comeback year in Caterham where he got basically crowdfunded, kickstarted into the team. He had a big budget behind him, and that basically allowed him to race most of the year. Unfortunately, as was the case of Marcus Ericsson, the team was falling apart, going through different ownership, and eventually just going into liquidation. I don't have a huge amount to say about Kobayashi. It was a very depressing end to his career, and what was, I think, a very good career. I think he was a very talented driver who just, unfortunately, just didn't have a place to go at that time of his career, especially when so many teams were strapped for cash. We're talking about a time when 2 or 3 of the teams were basically on the verge of bankruptcy. And we're not talking about the new teams. We're talking about people like Sauber and people like what is now Alpine, but was then Lotus Renault.
Yeah, in the end, he lacked money in a time where it was needed. He was good, but not great. And so, yeah, unfortunately, wrong place, wrong time. And sad as it is, his career came to an end after 2014.
Yeah, I got a really weird gift for this because it doesn't really make sense in this order. But I'm going to give him the least imaginative gift there is, and that is money. And I will get back to this gift later on, and you'll understand what I mean. So let's go on to the next
sounds
one.
Intriguing. And as I said earlier, the theme of the 11th entry and now the 9th is performing well against very good 2010 teams drivers, and that's why in 9th I have Jerome D'Ambrosio.
Ooh, okay. Jerome D'Ambrosio, again, famous for one moment in his entire career. A fuck up. Pardon me, a screw up. And that was when he was in the Hungarian Grand Prix in the rain and spun in the pit lane. Other than that, I remember nothing from his Marussia career. It was largely unrewarded due to, like so many drivers at that time, era of hyper reliability, perfectly dependable, but just was never ever put in a position where he could actually take advantage of anything. So he faded into obscurity with one full year of driving at Marussia, one race when Grosjean got banned, and otherwise faded into obscurity, or as it's also known, Formula E. And as a present, although it might be 11 years late, I would give him a new pair of trousers to replace his brown ones from that Hungarian pit incident. And, of course, a pack of custard, because the Ambrosia joke apparently is not yet tired 11 years on.
Absolutely not. Well, yeah. And we now enter the top 8, which means even in 2009 they would have gotten points. And we enter with but the actual oldest driver of those teams, namely the late, great Pedro de la Rosa. And the way I phrased that sounds like he died, but as far as I know, he's still very much alive.
At the time of recording, we are both pretty certain that Pedro de la Rosa is still alive, although we haven't seen him in a long time.
I think he does Spanish commentary, doesn't he? But
I don't know.
No way, I think that was Genie, but hey, whatever.
Yeah, Marc Gené recently took over Spanish commentary. Pedro de la Rosa had a glittering career, if that's what you want to call it. He had a career which spanned 3 decades. He, along with Michael Schumacher, were the last 2 drivers on the grid who raced in the 1990s. I'm saying these random stats and facts because I can't think of anything interesting to say about his time at HRT.
The thing is, those stats make him interesting, so it's one of those things where you don't need to say anything fascinating to enhance something just because the reality is already interesting enough. Yes,
he was better than Narain Karthikeyan, again, totally dependable, and I think that's why HRT kept hiring him, was for that reason, that he was dependable. Even in his age, he was able to get the car around and not embarrass himself and not throw it in the wall. And that when you compared it with the same year when he had Roman Grosjean, who was the young new star, and he was smashing it in the wall every race. HRT couldn't afford to have a driver like that, and so they picked two dependable drivers in De La Rosa and Kane, and it was a smart choice because De La Rosa was a perfectly dependable driver. Not much more to say than that.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Not surprised. I'm curious to see what he could have done in 2013 because he had signed a 2-year deal when he joined HRT in 2012. So then again, generally HRT should have made it to 2013 because the lineup of Marc Quinoy and Pedro de la Rosa would have been. Mwah.
Oh yeah, with a random mid-season replacement by Jaime Alguersuari just to put the cherry on the cake, just a one-off at Belgium or something.
Beautiful.
For Pedro de la Rosa's present, I am getting him a package of Nicorette. This podcast is not sponsored by Nicorette, but you shouldn't smoke. And Pedro de la Rosa shouldn't smoke either. And so to kick his bad habit, I would like to give him some nicotine replacement patches and pills.
Indeed, a very healthy choice. Anyway, on to the next driver, and this is actually the one I, when I made my rankings, jumped around a lot with, because he had 2 seasons with his team, namely with Lotus, and in one season, if I took the better part season of the 2, he would be near number 1, and if I took the worst of the 2, he would be somewhere in the region P15, P16, P17. And so I went with the gold middle, and at place 7, 7th place, we got Jarno Trulli.
Jarno Trulli, 2011 Reject of the Year, if I'm not mistaken.
I think
or was he? If he wasn't Reject of the Year, he was at the bottom somewhere on the podium. Yeah, Jarno Trulli's career did not end very gracefully. He had gone from Toyota, where he was still very dependable, even into his mid to late 30s, and it just took such a nosedive after Toyota collapsed. He went to Lotus, and I just didn't work out for him really. I think it started off with this air of optimism, as I think many of the drivers did who went to those teams. This air of optimism, like, okay, we're going to build up these teams from the ground up, and he, like other drivers who we're going to get to, lost that motivation over time. I think only one driver didn't ever show signs of losing that motivation, but Jarno Trulli certainly did. By 2011, he was just making up the numbers, and clearly his heart, I don't think, was really in it. So it's tough because he was in the late stage of his career, but also he had shown only a year or 2 prior that he had the ability. So I don't know if it depends on my mood, and it depends on your opinion of Jarno Trulli, I suppose. This is a very subjective one.
And what is Jarno getting?
I'm getting him a red trophy in the shape of Rubens Barrichello's face. I've written here, it's a testament to the great haul that F1 has now of, quote, that driver who complains all the time without self-righteousness. So yeah, Jarno Trulli did complain a lot back in those days, and I feel like F1 is certainly missing that character who complains all the time. We have one or two, but it's always with this air of like, oh, I'm for the greater good, and I don't want drivers who care about things. I want drivers who complain, and we can make fun of them for it.
Yeah. And since we are on the topic of Jarno Trulli, let's actually talk about a replacement, who is next on the list. In 6th, I got Vitaly Petrov.
I'm fascinated that you haven't brought him up earlier, because I understand you're going to argue that in comparison to his teammate Heikki Kovalainen, he was possibly not nearly as disappointing as people were expecting him to be, but he was still there for his money. Yeah, I know what you're going to say, so please say it.
See, the thing is, he actually did very well against Heikki Kovalainen, who, while he was not quite as motivated as he was in 2011, still was a good driver, and coming off the best, if not one of the best, or if not outright the best, new team season in 2011. So, yeah, he pretty much hung with one of the best of them, and yeah, that's why I feel, that's why I gave him a very high ranking, and yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Or did you expect me to say something else?
No, that's exactly what I expected you to say. This rating really depends on how you see Kovalainen's 2012. There is a narrative that Kovalainen's 2012 was much, much worse than his 2011 one, and I think that's a bit too easy, because it wasn't he didn't just suddenly get worse in 2012, but he had a couple of moments which were really good, but his consistency in 2011, it's comparable, I think, when we spoke about the 2012 season review in a previous podcast. I spoke about Fernando Alonso in the same way, that he was so good in 2012 that there was no possible way he could do that in 2013. And in 2013 he had great races, but they weren't every race, because you just simply can't keep up that level of consistency, and Kovalainen didn't. In 2012 he was a bit disappointing. He was no longer there to grab those moments, and Petrov was. Petrov finished 11th in the final crazy race at Brazil and nearly got a point. And just like Felipe Nasr, he got shafted because he got the team a good result. By getting that 11th place, he at the very last minute bumped Lotus, or Caterham, I think as it was at that point, ahead of Marussia. And what it meant was that Caterham got all the money and they didn't need to pay Petrov anymore. So if I was to give Petrov a present, I would give him justice for his 2013 seat. And I will provide this justice, as I've written down here, by my way, which is commenting on Discord. Or
the most...
If not justice, if you want something more practical, I will give him a cereal box toy of Batman to dispense justice with. And I have in brackets here, do they still sell toys with cereal anymore? That's a question for our audience. Like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us if that's still a thing. Maybe I'm living in 1975, but I have no idea if they sell toys with cereal anymore.
Honestly, neither do I. I have seen CDs a couple of times, but yeah.
What I put for Kobayashi was money, and what I actually wrote in brackets was Petrov's money, because I think had Petrov just given his money to Kobayashi, and Kobayashi had been given a better seat in 2013, for example, I think the money could have gone to some better use. Let's just say that.
All right, on to the top 5. And honestly, if you had told me before this exercise that I would have placed this driver here, I would have been very surprised, but it is what it is. And after careful consideration, I've come to the conclusion that P5 belongs to Vitantonio Liuzzi.
Yes, this has been a very late addition to the list. I'll get straight to the trophy, because it's obviously directly related to that one thing that he did, which we all know what we're talking about. He, back in old retro games, when you played racing games, you used to get awards. Like, each player in multiplayer would get an award. This is like an old-fashioned thing, and from the 1990s, Lennart. Do you remember it? But there was this old award you would get if you went off the track all the time, which was the excavator trophy. And so I am awarding the excavator trophy to Vitantonio Liuzzi for the briefest of moments putting his HRT in a fantastic 8th place.
Brilliant stuff. Just brilliant driving. That excellent P8, short-lived as it was, will never be forgotten.
Well, unfortunately, it didn't last very long. In fact, it lasted about half a second before he plowed straight into Vitaly Petrov and Nico Rosberg, and I think someone else as well.
But as we know from motorsport, qualifying half a second is a lot of time.
Yes, if you take only those two facts into account, that makes it sound like he's really good. Yes, so I think we'll leave it at that. Liuzzi was. Wait, why did you put Liuzzi so high?
Well,
was it...
for one, he basically assumed the role of team leader coming straight off a fresh Reject of the Year season on a team that did the very same thing as it did in 2012, namely not even being able to assemble their car in time for the season opener. The famous "This could be you" HRT. And he had the edge against Kartikeyan, he had the edge against Ricciardo, both in qualifying and generally speaking in the race. He just performed admirably as far as I'm concerned, and quite frankly, yeah, it's just he was basically a better version of Pedro de la Rosa, who I placed 8th, and there you could argue that maybe you could put Trulli higher than him, maybe not, but again, that's what I addressed in the Trulli part, where it's one year where you couldn't place him really high and the other one where you just couldn't. So
I must say I'm giving a hard disagree here, but this is your ranking, so I will not.
No, by all means do.
I disagree. That's the end of my argument.
That's the
entirety of my model.
Then again, more compelling than my usual arguments for Hulm's Barrichello's greatness, but... Well, on to P4 then, and in P4 we have a former DTM champion and current Porsche driver in Formula E, that is Pascal Wehrlein. The one of two drivers who scored points with the 2010 team.
One of the many drivers who's been screwed out of a Formula E championship, if you are to believe, Lennart.
His never forget Puebla. I certainly won't.
You can read all about it in Lennart's column, The Gravel Trap, which is available on gpprojects.com. Pascal Wehrlein is your bugbear when it comes to, in your opinion, a great driver who never got the results or the recognition that he deserved.
Yeah, that's pretty much a good summary. I think I won't go far as to say should be a world champion, because that's a bit presumptuous, and B, assumes a lot of what if, but I certainly think he could have been one.
He seemed very talented when he was at Manor, which is what we're talking about, and that's why he's so highly rated. I don't disagree with that at all. He scored 10th in Austria, I remember it very well. Everyone was hoping that Rosberg's car would give out when they were on the final lap, when he and Hamilton had one of their many embarrassing come-togethers, because it would have promoted Wehrlein up to 9th. But 10th was fine, and it was the very last point for Manor.
So the thing is, funnily enough, with all that, with the Hamilton and Rosberg business, the part that was forgotten, there was another last lap retirement that put him 10th in the first place, and that was Sergio Perez having, I think it was brake issues, but don't take me too literally. And that one could be...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I see your memories. Your searching of Wikipedia is better than mine.
No, that one I actually remember that one, obviously, because I don't want to say I went to the roof and joy, but it was pretty damn close to the roof.
Yeah, I remember him getting the points, but I don't remember the context.
Yeah.
If I were to give a present to Pascal Wehrlein, I would give him a copy of the world-famous, best-selling self-help book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Because the criticism I've always heard of Pascal Wehrlein is he's one of these people who gets tarnished with the brush, quote, difficult to work with. I'm not sure anything of the actual details behind the scenes, but I've heard, a bit like Esteban Ocon and some other drivers, that his attitude wasn't always gelling with the teams that he was at, namely at Sauber, and as a result he didn't open enough doors for himself to continue his career in Formula One. That's just what I've heard, but I'm going to comment on it anyway because it's one of these narratives that feels like it's probably true, even though I have no evidence for it. That's the narrative I go with in my mind.
And to do the obvious lame joke, it would explain why I relate to him so much. Haha.
Nice.
Yeah, anyway. As I said, he was very good in his 2016 season. Came in fresh off a DTM title. Obviously, he was helped a bit by the fact that arguably the 2016 Manor was the, relatively speaking, most competitive of all the 2010 teams' cars, simply on the account of having that powerful Mercedes engine. But again, he had to be there. He did be there.
He did be there.
Yeah.
and his teammates.
My English
his
is
teammates weren't.
Excellent today. You almost don't notice that I'm a ESL speaker, even though I don't actually treat myself as one, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, he was there. He did what he needed to do to inherit that point on the expense of Paris, and yeah, he had a great season. He got the point. He again is one of two people who have done that, and yeah, that's why I placed him fourth.
And shall we go straight to our podium?
Indeed.
Number 3.
In third, I have Timo Glock. Back-to-back Germans.
Timo Glock. Probably, as I said earlier, the only driver who never really embarrassed themselves from start to finish, and probably the only driver who drove the only driver of the two drivers who drove 3 seasons, him and Kovalainen. He, unlike Kovalainen, never lost his consistency. He was always there or thereabouts. Some people even argue that his 2012 season was his best one, but that's perhaps mostly just because 2012 had more variety to it in terms of reliability problems. So perfectly strong driver, not exactly the best way he could have ended his career, but whatever choice did he have? He had a nice moment at Singapore in 2012 where he was almost at the points. And yeah, I mean, there's very little criticism you can give of the guy other than that he was driving a slow car and he had his off days, but he also had very strong days. He was a very dependable driver, and that's the reason why they kept him on for 3 years. It's hard really to have a strong opinion about Timo Glock, I think.
Yeah, the thing is, I have a bit more context on Timo Glock's time with Marussia because obviously I watched Formula 1 on German television at the time, and it was the way RTL ran qualifying. It went something like this. They had the qualifying sessions, Q1, Q2, Q3, and after Q1 and Q2, they generally interviewed a driver, and if they had a German driver to interview, they obviously went with a German driver. And given as we are talking about Marussia, Timo Glock was pretty much always the guy that ended up interviewed after Q1. And that is one thing that makes his time at Marussia very praiseworthy, in that you could really feel his motivation leaving his body. Like in 2010, he was doing we're struggling, but it's going to get better in the future. Then this slowly started to get worse in 2011, and by 2012 you could often hear like, Jesus Christ, what am I even doing here? But with all of that in mind, he performed admirably, as you said, had arguably his best race in that entire period in Singapore, and very late in 2012. So yeah, it's a very praiseworthy performance. And while I said earlier that it's mostly the lower positions that are interchangeable, you can make a very solid case that he should be second on the list, simply because, for me, the point that separated driver second from driver third was pretty much just the better peak of the second driver, which we'll get to. So yeah, again, I'm not going to disagree with anyone or blame anyone who thinks Glock should be ahead of the second place driver, which I will tell everyone about after you've given Glock his gift.
This is probably the most surreal gift I'll give to anyone this evening, and that's a copy of The Immaculate Collection by Madonna. Because Timo Glock, like The Immaculate Collection, saw through all the early hits of Manor Marussia, as it was known. Almost all the highlights of that time period of the team were all him and not his teammates. He had the measure of his teammates, and he left without very much shame. He had a solid collection of hits in the early days of Marussia, and so I feel like Madonna's greatest hits album of the late 80s is a perfect fit for Timo Glock.
That's a good one. Oh, legal disclaimer, this podcast is not sponsored by Madonna.
No, unfortunately not. She would sue us the moment we used any of our music in our video. I don't want her taking all the royalties. Of the mighty royalties we're getting from this podcast. All right. So yeah. We have number 2 and number 1.
On to P2 then. We start with Heikki Kovalainen in second. As I said, as you pointed out exactly, he is one of the 2 drivers to last 3 seasons with his team. And he had a very brilliant 2011. Even beyond 2011, in 2012 he was obviously down here from that, but he wasn't bad, he wasn't slow, he was just not as excellent as he was. And quite frankly, that's something I always struggle, forgive me for moving on a tangent here, it's always something I struggle to really criticize people for, unless you have the feeling that their one top season was a fluke. Then it's just not fair for someone to not keep up their one in a lifetime excellent performance. But hey, that's neither here nor there.
Nothing lasts forever, and something that doesn't last forever is motivation. Kovalainen never scored any points for any of for the Team Lotus Caterham that he was driving for, and that's a big shame, because he was clearly, in my opinion, the best driver of that era in those teams. He was so good, and he got no reward for it, and it's a shame that his career ended that way. He didn't cover himself up in glory with McLaren, and that's probably the reason why he ended up at that team. But he also had some of the most iconic moments. I remember in Japan he was running in something like 11th the whole race in 2011. This in a time when hyper reliability was a thing. You would have like one retirement in a race. So on merit, he was basically pushing for the points after doing like a solid Q2 performance in that green car. I'm thinking in Singapore when his car blew up in 2010 and it caught fire and the marshals weren't doing anything about it, so he had to run and get a fire extinguisher himself and put out the fire in his own car. You know, these are the legendary moments of that team, and indeed most of the new teams. So he has most of those moments, and I think for that reason alone he deserves a top spot on this list. And it's a shame he never got a point, because he absolutely deserved them.
So, what award does Heike get?
I've given as a present a large knitted hanging tapestry from all the boys and girls at the Leafield Technical Centre. For context, that's where the team was based. For giving us all hope that the green team might actually one day score a point. So, a big banner which says knitted, "Thank you, Heike."
That is one of the loveliest one we had today, and I'm somewhat tempted to actually try to find as many Leafield people as we can find now and actually make that a reality. So if you are listening to this podcast and have worked for Team Lotus, Caterham at the time, do feel free to tell us in the comments so we can get you knitting.
Or indeed any of the Leafield circuit people, because one of the wonderful things about Leafield Technical Centre, is it has also worked with, it's also been the hub of many other reject teams, namely early 2000s Arrows and Super Aguri. So it's almost like that base it's like a recipe for disaster. It's like cursed. It's like no team ever went to Leafield and came out of it successful, did they?
But they all were memorable.
Yeah, exactly. In their own way, they were memorable. So now, number one is somewhat an obvious, and we're going to get very serious, I'm sure, a very serious choice.
The number one place, as those who have paid attention will obviously have realized, is Jules Bianchi. The only driver to score points with the 2010 teams when we talk about the plural of points. Point.
Yeah.
The plural of points. His 2014 Monaco Grand Prix drive will, as far as I'm concerned, never be forgotten in reject lore. And even beyond that, he had excellent outings all throughout his 2014 season and his 2013 seasons with the team. And including, for example, making Q2 on pretty much merit at Hungary. Pretty much the weak circuit, one of the weak circuits of the 2010 teams due to their lack of aerodynamic development and, well, aerodynamic competence in the sense of having the personnel to get the car sufficiently well. Yeah, it's a driver. In a way, it feels wrong to say that, but it's a driver where I can make the point that I genuinely liked him before. It was cool because I saw his driving back in the F3 Euro series, when it was a feeder of the DTM, and its races were broadcast again on German television, and I saw this young French kid making waves, impressing, and I thought this kid is going to make it to Formula One, and he did. He did get to Russia as part of their deal with Ferrari, and he was brilliant.
My memory is funny. There's a weird sheer coincidence that I joined the forum, at least, of F1 Rejects, as it was at the time, the weekend just before Monaco. I think it was a few days before Monaco 2014 that I officially joined the forum. So I joined the forum at the time of the greatest reject moment of probably the time of F1 Rejects. And the thing I remember the most about him scoring the points, as well as the fact that he was actually penalised, if I'm not mistaken. I think he actually finished 8th, but was dropped down to 9th. But
he had a 5-second penalty, so I don't remember what for. I think it was...
Yeah, there were a lot of incidents that race.
Yeah.
There were a lot of incidents, especially from his teammate, for example, in the Saubers. But the thing I remember most about that race was watching it with my dad, and then after the race, obviously they interviewed everyone, and then they interviewed Jules Bianchi, and I remember thinking, because he's opened his mouth and he had a really high-pitched voice, I thought, and I was like, this dude has been driving for like a year and a half, and I've literally never heard him speak. It's like that was how little attention these backmarker teams got from like the BBC at the time, and it's such a shame because they really were the heroic drivers. They really were the people who were struggling the most and putting in the most effort to desperately try and get themselves the briefest amount of glory. And I was like, this dude Jules Bianchi was even touted for a long time as being a future Ferrari driver. You can roll your eyes at that because everyone has been touted as a future Ferrari driver, but Jules Bianchi, unlike Kovalainen, unlike Jarno Trulli, unlike Kobayashi and many of these drivers, Jules Bianchi was not on the way down, he was on the way up. And it very much seemed like he had potential to be picked up by any other team and make a career of himself. Daniel Ricciardo was a special case because he was deliberately airdropped in to get some experience. But Jules Bianchi made his own way, and he got 2 points, should have been 4, at Monaco, on his own merit. And he was on the way up, and that's what makes his death so much more tragic. And it's why I'd say I wouldn't disagree at all with that number 1 placing, because he really it was such a tragedy that it had to be him of all the drivers who died.
Yeah, and I made the point jokingly earlier that the fact that we had 2 Indianapolis 500 winners in it, that meant that the 2010 teams did fulfill the classic idea of adding new teams, that more spots for young talents became free. And when we later talk seriously and think more about that concept of new teams as spots for young drivers to prove themselves, Jules Bianchi was, or would have been, more precisely, the masterpiece of that. It's, as you said, the idea of someone being a future Ferrari driver is a concept that generally draws a lot of mockery in the Formula 1 community, and not for no reason. Certainly justified that idea, but I mean, up to a certain point, you'd be inclined to take Sebastian Vettel's word for it. Funny how all of our topics tie back together, don't they?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a good circle, isn't it?
Yeah. As he famously said after his 2015 victory at Hungary. But yeah, it's just a tragedy of the sport, and I don't want to get too contemplative about the topic of death in racing, because I've written an entire gravel trap on that, and so I don't want to repeat myself. But yeah, it's a tragedy, but it is a tragedy that was the sad ending of a story that was well worth telling. And as I said, he's the number 1 in my ranking of the 2010 team drivers. Yeah.
Mine too. Thank you. And especially with if we're judging things just based on the performances that they gave at the team, he gave the best performance. He got a 9th place, and no driver got a better performance than that in any of the races over the 7 seasons that those teams were around. So it's a bit of a sad note to end on, but I think it's an important one to end on. If I had a gift to give him, I've never been to Monte Carlo, but if I ever do go, I'd like to find his. I understand he's not buried, but I understand he has a memorial, and I'd like to put a flower there. I guess I have a bit of a morbid sense of things, but I used to live in Paris, and I discovered that Pierre Levesque, who was the driver who died at Le Mans in 1955 and caused the large accident, I found he was buried about 5 minutes walk from where I lived when I lived in Paris, and I went there and put a flower down on his grave. And I don't know why I did that, because I never knew him, and I never knew the guy, and I never lived through that, but it felt right to do that. So
yeah, I feel you. I mean, in the end, they are just as much a part of the entire story of racing as the drivers that lived and the drivers that were, the drivers that are to come. It is all part of a giant puzzle, and I feel like I won't go so far as to say it's a fan's duty to acknowledge that, but I think it really enhances one's fandom if one keeps awareness of that fact, of the realities, of the sometimes tragic realities of motorsport. So I think it was the right thing to do, and obviously if I were in your position, I would have done the same. So,
but yeah, I suppose if we do end on a serious note, is that while we at GP Rejects, as it's now called, celebrate these drivers and we mock them, but we do it in jest and we do it with a sense of good grace. These are drivers who work damn hard to desperately try and scrabble away to get a point, and we're basically ignored by if you want to call it mainstream motorsport news. And it's for that reason that F1 Rejects and GP Rejects, as it's now is, it's our reason for why we're here, is to shine a light on those people, because we believe that they deserve as much a time in the limelight as the front runners do.
Wonderfully said.
And I think that's how I will close on that.
Indeed, and I'm going to agree with you, and I want to, especially since you are the one who has written the majority, is it by now the majority of our profiles? If not, it's probably very close. And so I especially want to thank you for your part in doing that. I obviously try to do the best to keep those stories alive in my own way. And yeah, obviously we want to thank the people who are listening to this podcast, who are interested in these stories. And yeah, thank you for your interest. We hope this ranking was informative at the very least, or if not, then it was at least entertaining. And with that, well, we said it earlier, but why not do the YouTube cliche again? Like, comment, subscribe. Especially comment. We would love to hear from you. And with that, there's only one lesson to remember. Where teammates are close, teammates collide.